Hello students, welcome back for week 4 of your class. I just want to talk about a few things in this short video about the material that you're going to see this week. So you'll notice in the syllabus that your chapter selections for this week are chapters 6 and 7 from your Krugman textbook and article 4.3 in the reader. Well, chapters 6 and 7 in the Krugman book are really where macroeconomics kicks into high gear. Chapter 6 is all about how we measure and track the macro economy, and like you'd imagine, that is sort of the key to a macroeconomics class, is being able to gauge different parts of the economy and measure how they're performing. So chapter 6 is especially important, and also chapter 7 on unemployment and especially on inflation, using the CPI values to measure inflation. Very essential macro subjects for you to deal with. So just a couple of things to be on the lookout for as you go through this hunk of the course material. Chapter 6, measuring the macro economy. The big thing we look at there is production. The volume and value of all the production of goods and services that an economy can produce. And of course the term that we use for that thing is GDP, right? GDP, gross domestic product, meaning the total or gross amount of all the production, all the making of goods, that's the product, that are produced within some particular economy. That's the domestic part, produced within your domestic economy, like within your national borders. So gross domestic product just refers to the total value of everything an economy produces, usually in a year. You can also see quarterly numbers for GDP as well. So the total value of all the production in some period of time, that's GDP. And GDP is the most important economic indicator for you to know. When we talk about how the economy is doing, or someone on TV says the economy is doing great, the first thing that they're talking about, and often the only thing they'll mention, is the rate of growth of GDP. So usually the idea is market economies, they're supposed to grow over time, meaning each year you have a bigger GDP than before. As time goes on, your economy produces more and more, you make more products and they become more valuable, so you get a growing GDP over time. We call this economic growth. And indeed, GDP just kind of gets used as a synonym for the economy. So economic growth refers to growth in GDP, not necessarily in the average standard of living in the economy, for example. Or when we compare different countries, you may hear it said that the United States has the world's biggest economy, and China has the second biggest, and Japan's is number 3. What they're measuring there is GDP of these different economies and ranking them by how big they are. Okay? So that's what GDP is all about. It's very central. Over time, we use GDP to measure economic growth, which you'll see is a major part of chapters 8 and 9, which we'll be looking at next week, right, in week 6. So you'll see we put a lot of miles on GDP, so it's definitely something to get familiar with. One thing you'll notice in, I think, chapter 6, pretty early, they introduce you to both real versus nominal GDP. Now, basically, the short version is real GDP is inflation adjusted. So you're looking at different GDP values from one year to the next. Real GDP is adding up dollar values for everything produced in the economy, but compensating for inflation. Okay, and inflation, of course, as you'll see in chapter 7, refers to the gradual increase in prices over time. All right. And you'll see why inflation occurs and how we measure that in that chapter. We'll talk about it in a second. But the short version is, if prices are gradually increasing, maybe at a fast rate, maybe at a slow rate in your economy, that means each year many products cost a little more than before. Well, if we just add up those total numbers, we're going to get kind of an extra big GDP figure, because GDP essentially comes from adding up the market prices of everything we produce. Kind of like to see the total value of everything you make, you add up the sticker prices of everything you produce in a year, which is fine. It's an important piece of data. We call that nominal GDP. So you're just using that year's prices or current prices to calculate a GDP value. Real GDP compensates for inflation using methods that you'll see when we get to inflation in a couple of weeks. And in that way, you get a real GDP number that, as it changes and grows over time, is only showing you increases in the total value of production, compensating for inflation, so we don't get an extra big value. So you'll see that in Chapter 6, and be on the lookout. You want to understand the difference between nominal and real GDP. We'll use it a lot once we get to calculating GDP, which will happen pretty soon. Okay, so that's important. Also in these chapters you'll see the concept of inflation, which we just referred to. It's the gradual increase in the price level over time. Gradual increase in the overall prices in some economy as time continues. Now, just because a product or a particular thing gets more expensive, that's not necessarily inflation, right? Maybe there's a limited supply relative to demand. Okay, like oil, more and more people want to consume energy. The supply of oil is relatively slow to grow, at least until lately. So that price may be going up just because of supply and demand fundamentals. Inflation refers to the overall increase in prices across the economy as time goes on. And there's a lot to say about inflation. You'll see a good deal about it in the Krugman book. I just want to say something about the way we measure inflation. Because the fact is, there's a couple ways to do it. The main way that's principally used is using what we call the Consumer Price Index, the CPI. And the Consumer Price Index just measures a sort of a general basket of consumer goods and looks at different markets across the United States and says, how much does this basket of goods cost now? Like how many dollars? And what the CPI does is takes that dollar cost this year, like now, of this basket, and they divide it by the cost of that basket in some previous year that they want to compare it to. So maybe we'll take the price of the basket this year and divide it by the cost of the same basket of goods in, say, 2010 or 1980, okay, whenever we want to. And then, okay, we'll have a CPI number. It's just a 3-digit number. Okay. We can use those CPI numbers, put them into a simple change formula to calculate the rate of inflation, showing us how fast, on a percent basis, are these prices increasing. So you'll take the CPI value for a later year, subtract the CPI value of an earlier year, which we call the base year, and then divide by the CPI of that base year. And you'll convert that to a percentage, and you'll see that process done on page 203 of your book, and they do give you some examples to deal with as well, which are handy. And you'll have some more homework next week that will give you a chance to work on them too. But that concept of inflation is pretty important. That, along with basic economic growth, is the main thing that you're going to need to deal with this week. And these ideas are pretty important. They're definitely worth your time. And one of the things to draw your attention to is this week's reader article. Because as we're getting into economic growth, what you're going to discover is that economic growth has a variety of factors that contribute to it. But maybe the most important one is investment. Investment spending. Essentially, investment spending is spending by companies on capital. So it's when companies spend money to be more productive and to increase the size of their business. So remember, physical capital is what we're talking about here. That's any tool or equipment you use on the job. So think of the computer or cash register or office or work equipment that you use at your job. That's physical capital. When companies buy new capital or better capital, or build a new office building or a new factory and fill it with machinery and tools, all that spending on capital is investment spending. That's how we use the term in economics. Okay? It doesn't just mean something you buy to make money on. That's how we normally use the term investment. Investment means spending by businesses to be more productive and increase the size of the company in terms of its production. All right. Well, take a look in the textbook as we go through this chapter and the following ones on economic growth. What you're going to see is that investment, sort of deservedly, for good reason, gets credit as being sort of the big driving force in economic growth, which is fine. But it does give you a kind of sense that investment is this very calm, rational process where entrepreneurs and executives make investment decisions, and it leads to economic growth, and it's a very smooth process. Take a look at your reader article for this week, okay, article 4.3 in your reader book. And what you're going to discover is that this process is not exactly smooth at all. In fact, the strong historical trend is for large bubbles, as we call them, very strong, irrational growths in the value, in the price of some asset, and then it comes crashing back down again. So you get bubbles and crashes on a sort of recurrent basis. We just had one of these a few years ago with regard to real estate. We may be experiencing the end of a bubble in gold and gold-derived assets right now. It's sort of unclear. It takes time to see whether things are a bubble or not, or what the market situation is. So they're pretty common, and you want to take a look at that short article, which just gives you a little tiny taste of the long history of economic bubbles inflating and then exploding and having significant effects on the economy. Has to do with how investors, and especially financial figures and businesses, perceive the value of assets in the future, and how they think other participants of the market will assess that value, which is a hugely important thing if you're in the financial markets. So take a look at that reader article as well. It's less than 2 pages, so it shouldn't be too crushing of a burden on top of your larger textbook chapters this week. You've got a lot of textbook reading this week, so we're a little light on reader articles. Next week you've got just one fairly large size book article and a little more from the reader. Okay, we'll be mixing it up as we go through the term. Use the syllabus calendar to keep up with that reading assignment. And there you go. Okay, that should be enough of a little introduction to the stuff you'll see in this chapter. Of course, you got the usual discussion board assignment. You'll have a quiz due by the end of the week on Sunday night. And there you go. I'll see you all on the discussion boards.